Trauma leaves deep scars, both visible and invisible to the eye. When abuse unfolds over an extended period, the wounds can cut to the very core of one's identity and self-worth. While initially a matter of sheer survival, this traumatic conditioning can insidiously shape how we view ourselves and the world around us going forward. Today we'll explore the phenomenon of the poor me victim mentality, how it can take root after narcissistic abuse or other toxic traumatic bonds, and why it becomes so difficult to shed this identity even when the original abuser is long gone. Let's begin by understanding how this mentality evolves. When trapped in a cycle of abuse from a narcissistic partner, parent, authority figure, or anyone whose psychological manipulation holds power over our reality, we're forced into a perpetual state of hypervigilance just to endure. Every ounce of energy gets drained merely dodging put-downs, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering their rages, suppressing our own voices, and dimming our identities to satisfy their hunger for control. We become exhausted victims, constantly reminded through word and action that we are small, insignificant, even deserving of the devaluation and dehumanization cast upon us. Our fundamental perspectives bend to accommodate their distortion field as the price of remaining sane and safe from further abuse. We internalize their denigrating narratives about us by sheer force. A trauma bond cementing our constructed role as perpetual unlucky victims takes ingrained root in our psyche. Poor me becomes the lens. Now comes the tragic paradox. Even after we finally escape that malignant source of abuse, whether the narcissist simply moves on from us or we heroically extract ourselves from their inky grasp, we often remain reflexively viewing reality through the refracted victim lens they systemically groomed into our consciousness. To our core, we've shape-shifted into chronically bracing for the next denigrating slight, even in mundane daily interactions, as if perpetually stuck and armored up in that primal trauma response seared into our psyche, the aftershock of that seismic fragmentation still rattling us to our marrow. From our deeply entrenched vantage point, the world now looks monolithically terrifying, a forever minefield of potential victimizations and cruelties awaiting. We expect the worst through that same fog tunnel vision instilled through the abuse cycle's erosive conditionings. Poor me becomes our habitual umbrella of coping, shielding us from hoped-for hurt before it can theoretically materialize. We still reflexively default to that trauma-riddled, disempowered internal position as our warped new homeostasis, even when there are no actual threats. So now, ironically freed from the original abuser, but tragically still psychically imprisoned by our conditioning, we may become subconsciously addicted to continuing that fated victim narrative, as familiar and miserable as it's become. Our fractured identity and fears of re-merging with the self we were before that founding trauma took root can cause us to almost unconsciously seek out new sources of victimization to perpetuate that warped belonging, that certainty of despair our trauma bonding has disfigured into felt kinship. We may unwittingly self-sabotage by inviting new emotional vampires into our experience, recreating microcosms of that intolerable dynamic, as if hardwired to accept cruelty while rejecting compassion that could prompt emotional liberation. These become catalytic bonds that feed our regressive addiction as we subconsciously flee true healing precisely when it's finally within reach. That victim's refuge of poor me now reified into a darkly sacred temple that must remain intact, lest we face walking through the fires of genuine rebirth. The poor me mentality can become so ingrained that even in the presence of loving support, the person may unconsciously distort reality to maintain their victim identity and get that psychological fix of feeling victimized. Perhaps most insidious of all, this deeply entrapped poor me psyche can actually become so pathologically ingrained that we start unconsciously distorting even the most loving, supportive relationships and circumstances in our lives. Like addicts seeking the next hit to feed our dependency, we may compulsively misinterpret well-intentioned words, actions, or gestures from caring loved ones in order to extract narratives that reinforce our victimhood and self-perceptions as the wounded, hard-done-by party. In these cases, the trauma and identity we've bonded with as victims has become a sort of psychological captor, It's literally all we know how to experience in our dissociative state. Any authentic love or compassion that could threaten the dominance of this victim identity gets reflexively recontextualized through funhouse mirrors. So caring advice from friends gets filtered as judgmental criticism, subliminally aimed at making us feel small and inadequate once again. Playful teasing from a partner is received with triggering distortions of past belittling abuse. Innocuous oversights are unconsciously converted into overt proof of our unworthiness of consideration. When trapped in this self-victimizing mindset, our perceptions become utterly shaped by the trauma we've endured. Like sunglasses with only dark lenses remaining, we can't help but view everything through the refracted prism of past abuse and mistreatment. So when friends or family try to help by offering caring advice or suggestions, our fractured psyche automatically receives it as veiled judgments designed to undermine our fragile self-worth yet again. Those innocent recommendations get filtered through the all too familiar lens of being criticized, shamed, or made to feel small and inadequate, just like the original abuser's tactics. Even something as innocuous as a romantic partner's playful teasing or gentle prodding gets unconsciously distorted into re-experiencing the full psychological brunt of previous belittling put-downs and contemptuous jabs. Our guard stays permanently up, unable to discern attempt at closeness from perceived attack. The most minor oversights, unintended errors, or inadvertent insensitivities from loved ones get unconsciously magnified and misconstrued through the victim's lens as glaringly purposeful ways of conveying our utter unworthiness of consideration or basic human regard. Any tiny potential slight gets inflated into unmistakable proof that we remain as constantly disrespected as the trauma conditioning insists. Like junkies chasing the chemical embrace of sorrow we've come to recognize as home, we filter out the light and amplify any specks of darkness that can be twisted into further self-victimizing narratives. Our lens remains obstructed by hurt, even amid abundant affirmation and acceptance. On a neurological level, victimization has become our fix, the only pattern our fractured identity can resonate with to feel stable, familiar, and uncompromised. Unconditional love itself gets framed as yet another trauma in desperate bids to preserve our hardwired hurt addiction. Healing through this terminal level of traumatic bonding requires a level of self-awareness many may never access about the depths of our self-perpetuating psychological prisons. But until we can truly re-witness the light through uncorrupted eyes, the poor me victim will remain shackled to this self-created purgatory, no matter how much light attempts to infiltrate. From a clinical psychology perspective, what we are observing with this ingrained poor me self-victimization is a textbook case of traumatic reenactment compulsion. This is the mind's deeply unconscious drive to reconstruct familiar dynamics and interpersonal patterns, even when they are objectively abusive or maladaptive. At the core is a paradoxical attempt to master the original trauma by continually re-exposing oneself to its themes and emotional undercurrents. However, rather than resolving the unmetabolized suffering, these reenactments merely keep the wound unhealed and suppurating. The psyche becomes entrapped in an infinitely looping cycle of perpetuating its own re-traumatization by continuously seeking out and distortively perceiving situations that reinscribe the shaming, belittling abuse narratives onto the sufferer's identity. Even healthy relationships and overtly loving scenarios get subconsciously sabotaged, with the traumatized individual compulsively introducing toxic projections that corrupt any authentically nurturing or validating experience that could threaten their hardwired self-concept as an eternal victim deserving of mistreatment. This insidious psychodynamic represents the traumatized ego's deepest feared existential despair, that genuine unconditional acceptance and reprieve from interminable pain may render their entire self-structure existentially obsolete and void of purpose. So they reject it at an unconscious level. The traumatic bonding has become so totalizing that a psychological prison renovation is preferable to an uncertain freedom. Safety and identity preservation get prioritized over any authentic growth that could destabilize these psychologically cancerous self-certainties. Intervening at this level necessitates an almost existential rebirth through a specialized therapeutic process I'll call traumatic reparenting. It involves surgically revisiting the core traumatic fragmentation and initiating a systematic reparenting of the psyche from its very roots. This reparative work guides the sufferer through a profound grieving process, allowing themselves to finally metabolize the original definitional abuse and wounding by integrating it rather than continuously expelling it onto their external reality. Simultaneously, the therapist serves as a transcendent reprinting object and archetypal mirror, reflecting back the intrinsic wholeness and unconditional worth that the traumatized ego has dissociated from and fortressed itself against experiencing. It is an enormously vulnerable process of slowly being reminded of one's innate perfection despite the distortions of past traumas. But through this felt experience of being reparented into existential self-attunement, the old self-victimizing complexes atrophy as new self-sovereign neurocircuitry is reinforced. While the road is arduous, this path of reparenting the ego out of its dissociated traumatic reenactment patterns allows the individual to reclaim their birthright wholeness over time, shedding the poor me victim mentality as the newly integrated self-structure comes online. With commitment and a skillful guide, even the most intractable cases of bonding with victimhood can be precisely reparented back into authenticity. It's never too late to access the loving essence always awaiting reintegration beneath those conditioned layers of traumatic resignation. Breaking free from this prison once and for all requires heroic self-awareness and commitment to a process that may feel deceptively agonizing before any light can be restored. It means letting go of those deeply grooved neural pathways, instinctively scanning for the next abandonment or devaluation, remaining excruciatingly present to the truth that the original trauma's choke chain isn't actually still tethered around our neck. It necessitates feeling the anguish of having been that desecrated, but then choosing to alchemize the trauma into fuel for our own sovereignty, rather than perpetually portraying ourselves as victims in need of rescue. This may involve systematic shadow work, uncovering every internalized lie about our self-worth being interwoven through the trauma narrative in order to exfoliate those falsehoods through radical self-love. It ultimately means forgiving ourselves for coping through the poor me identity for however long we remained confined there, recognizing those echoes were both understandable reflections of what we endured and also catalysts fueling our heroic return to wholeness. Only through this courageous process of empowering ourselves with the truth of our struggle's ephemerality compared to our eternal essence can we finally recast ourselves as free, self-determined individuals, no longer hostage to any mirrored poor me projections or mythic cycles of victimization. That path beckons, however arduous, for any who have played the role of the traumatized victim for too perilously long already. It's the final emancipation from that era's ghost lines still clinging to your spirit, your triumphant return to the home that's been awaiting you since first love dreamed you alive. Trauma shakes the snow globe of our perceived reality in shattering ways, but we must not allow the after tremors to calcify into an all-consuming identity as the poor me victim, a fractal of the trauma's original earthquake endlessly looping inside us. We owe it to ourselves to push past that default posture, to heal ourselves back into the wholeness we've always been destined for. Freedom from that self-created prison awaits for any who dare to see themselves as so much more than the trauma and abuse once dictated. You were born for triumph over adversity's cloaks of desecration, and that blazing truth within your indestructible core knows the way out into your brilliance already. The ultimate defiance against any injustice or abuse we've endured is not merely surviving it, but ascending completely out of those ashes reborn, owning the sovereign truth that no trauma ever could revoke. We were, are, and will forever remain whole and worthy beyond any fleeting violation's fictional rewrites. That is the triumph over the poor me mentality's lies, living as the truth we've always indomitably been.